Some of you might already know this, but quite recently I have gotten my A-level results back. And for those who don't know or don't remember or haven't watched any of my other videos, I have done A-level maths, further maths, physics, and my fourth subject is what some people consider to be unusual. I have done A-level philosophy. And I am very confident in my feeling that this subject is the one I am most proud of when it comes to the results I have gotten. Mainly because if you asked me 10 years ago, not ask me, if you told me 10 years ago that I would be doing A level philosophy, I'd probably laugh at you, mainly because 10 years ago I didn't even know how to speak English. But having said that, I think I know if you're someone who usually watches the maths in my YouTube channel, which is not something serious, then you might find this video quite unusual, and you'd be right. But also, I think if you're someone interested in logic, and uh, and also someone who's interested in something that is not maths, then I'd recommend watching some of this video, which is going to be a reaction to my scripts that I've gotten back. And also, if you're an A level philosophy student yourself, then I most definitely recommend watching this. I was very pleased when I saw my results, and I mean, I'm not going to gatekeep it. I have gotten an A star, and also I think quite a high one. I think, if I'm not wrong, 156 was the boundary for an A star. I got 177, which is something that I am pleased about. You have 2 3-hour papers without extra time. With extra time, that will be 3 hours and 45 minutes, and it's split between four topics: epistemology and moral philosophy, which is assessed in paper one, and then metaphysics of God and metaphysics of mind, which are assessed in paper two. It's 5 questions per section. There is a 3 marker, two 5 markers, one 12 marker, and finally one essay, which is worth 25 marks. And having said that, the way this video is going to work is that I am going to react to all of these. I was thinking of splitting this into non-essay questions and essay questions, because I think it's going to end up being a very long video. But to be fair, I am not looking forward to the logistics of doing two separate videos. So I'm just going to record one massive one. I'm going to read myself I'm going to record myself reading the script, and then I'll give my opinion, or I will give my opinion, and then there will be a cut to where I read the script.
What is an a priori deduction? An a priori deduction is a belief inferred independently from experience of the world, and it is justified inferentially, i.e., deductively, from another belief. An example of a priori deduction is a cosmological argument for Descartes.
I've only gotten 2 marks in this question, and I am not sure why. And the examiner says that my answer isn't full, but it is clear. So what I have done to answer this question is I remembered the definition that AQA themselves put out in their subject terminology PDF that they have on the AQA website, and they don't have the word a priori deduction, but they do have a priori intuition and deduction separately. A priori intuition, according to them, is a belief that is, one, non-inferentially justified. You do not need to infer an intuition from something else that you believe. And two, a priori or rational, justified without the need for experience. And then they give an example of an a priori intuition.
Explain Leibniz's argument for innatism based on necessary truths. Leibniz, as a response to Locke's claim that the mind at birth is tabula rasa, a blank slate, suggests that the mind at birth is understood better to be a block of vein marble. The analogy is that a sculpture already exists within the block, and a sculptor, i.e., experience, is needed in order to unravel the sculpture, innate concepts and ideas. And the sculpture would use the veins in the marble which represent our disposition to knowledge to do this unraveling. In support of this thesis of innatism, which is the view that there is at least some ideas, concepts present in the mind at birth or within the structures of the mind, Leibniz gives his argument based on necessary truths or general principles. Leibniz claims that there are two types of truths: contingent truths, propositions which are true in this world but could have been otherwise in other logically possible worlds, and necessary truths, propositions which are true in this world and must also be true in all other logically possible worlds. Leibniz further claims that we do have knowledge of some necessary truths. He gives the example of the law of non contradiction: something cannot be and be at the same time. Then Leibniz adds that a posteriori experience can only tell us about specific instances, but knowledge of necessary truths goes beyond that. He claims that no matter how many occurrences of specific instances occur, it is not enough to establish the truth of a general principle, necessary truth. Therefore, this knowledge of necessary truths that we do have does not come from experience, hence, it must come elsewhere, i.e., innately. This argument is an argument for innatism based on necessary truths.
I am pretty sure that this question may have annoyed a lot of people, especially those who did not remember, couldn't recall what the argument from necessary truth that Leibniz gave was, and only talked about the vein marble analogy, which is very tempting to only talk about that. And I'm pretty sure you probably would still get credited for it, but not full marks or even 3 or 4. Now, I think this question was on. I'm pretty sure this question was given a few years ago, and there is a mark scheme out there which I have seen and practiced from and rehearsed. Not because I thought we were going to get this as a 5 marker, but mainly because I thought we were going to get an essay on innatism. And I very much love A level philosophy mark schemes. They are, in my opinion, the best. Um, but also, what I did in this answer is I made sure that I was framing Leibniz as responding to Locke, as opposed to Locke responding to Leibniz. Now, the question is very clear that we have to talk about this argument. There are many other arguments against and for innatism. Um, and while I think when I first learned about innatism and Leibniz, I always thought that Locke was the one responding to Leibniz, and I'm pretty sure a lot of other people have this misconception. Um, and only after I have revised better and I have locked in and did my own research, I have realized that actually Leibniz, as it very much doesn't look like it, at least from the perspective of an A level student. He is the one responding to Locke and still somehow managing to not do a good job of it, unless I am the one straw manning him, of course.
Explain the role of philosophical skepticism within epistemology. Philosophical skepticism is a philosophical method to test the justification for truth claims. It is a method to understand better the nature between justification and knowledge. Philosophical skepticism can be in the form of local skepticism, i.e., skepticism about the justification we give for a specific branch of knowledge, e.g., skepticism about God. Philosophical skepticism can also be in the form of global skepticism, which is the doubting of justification of knowledge of all claims. In epistemology, the branch of philosophy which investigates how we know knowledge, the sources of knowledge, and the limits of knowledge, Philosophical skepticism can be used to show that the methods of justifications we have do not amount to knowledge. The definition of knowledge most commonly used by philosophical skepticism is infallibilism. Hence, it is a limitation of knowledge. An example of philosophical skepticism is Descartes' third wave of doubt, in which there is the evil demon hypothesis, a powerful being capable of making people believe in false propositions and make people doubt about logical propositions. This is a form of radical global skepticism which Descartes employs as part of his intuition and deduction thesis in order to find knowledge that we can be certain of. Descartes comes to the conclusion that the cogito, I think therefore I am, is an example of a truth claim that survives the evil demon hypothesis and hence survives global skepticism.
I think there's a trend in this paper of having quite unusual questions, not in terms of content, but the way the question is phrased. I was actually quite pleased with the question because I knew in my head that a lot of people would get, thrown off guard, but also because philosophical skepticism is one of my favorite topics. Now, I have employed advice from my philosophy teacher, from my epistemology teacher, when it comes to answering five markers. Um, when you have a question, let's say about direct realism, it's good to mention the fact that this is part of the topic of uh, perception as a source of knowledge. If you're talking about JTB or virtual reliabilism, then it might be worth mentioning that this is from the topic of the definitions of knowledge. In this case, particularly because of how the question was phrased, it was very natural for me to employ this advice and very explicitly mention that this is part of the topic of knowledge, the limitations of knowledge. And actually, I went a bit further and I also defined epistemology and kind of gave an one sentence outline of it. Um, I mean, the examiner quite glazes my answer, but I think it is just enough to get the marks, and I have gotten 5 marks in.
Explain why the conditions of the tripartite account of knowledge are not sufficient and explain how a reliabilist account of knowledge can be used as a response. The tripartite definition of knowledge, otherwise known as justified true belief, JTB, is a definition of knowledge which can be attributed to B from Plato, and it claims that any person S can know in a proposition P if and only if P is true, S believes that P, S is justified in believing that P. These conditions are individually necessary. All conditions must be met individually in order to have knowledge, and joint is sufficient. If all three conditions are met, this is enough to guarantee the outcome of knowing P. In 1963, Edmund Gettier publishes a paper in which he outlines two scenarios in which a person is said to satisfy the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for knowledge according to JTB. But we would not want to say that the person did have knowledge. One of the scenarios goes as follows. Smith and Jones are part of the same company, and there is a promotion coming up. The president of the company assures Smith that Jones will get the job. Smith goes to count the coins in the pocket of Jones and counts 10 of them. He then makes a proposition. The person who will get the job has 10 coins in the pockets. However, Smith is the one who ends up getting the job, and unbeknownst to him, he also has 10 coins in his pockets. This implies that Smith's proposition is true, and as Smith both believes in the proposition and is justified in believing in that proposition, as the president of the company gave him assurance, Smith is said to have met the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for knowing that proposition. But we would not want to say that Smith has knowledge, as this is merely an instance of epistemic luck and coincidence. However, although the tripartite definition of knowledge can be shown to have conditions which are not sufficient, A reliabilist account of knowledge can be used as a response to a get-here case. Reliabilism is a definition of knowledge in which S knows P if and only if P is true, S believes in P, and S's belief arises from a reliable cognitive process. A reliable cognitive process is a cognitive process which produces a high percentage of truth claims. An example of a reliable cognitive process is vision, and an example of a non-reliable cognitive process is complex mental arithmetic. In the case of the get-here case, the proponent of the reliabilist definition of knowledge can claim that Smith did not have knowledge because his belief did not arise from a reliable cognitive process. This can be explained in two ways. The first way is that his assurance from the president of the company may not be reliable, perhaps he misheard, or the company president lied. Or he counted the coins in the pocket wrong. Therefore, Smith, according to the reliabilist definition of knowledge, does not have the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for knowledge. In summary, we can say that the conditions of the tripartite account of knowledge are not sufficient by giving scenarios, get-here cases, where a person has all the jointly sufficient conditions but is said to not have knowledge. However, the reliabilist account can respond to such cases by replacing the justification condition with one of a reliable cognitive process, which Smith did not have in the original get-here case, hence responding to such example.
This is probably the 12 marker I have rehearsed the most. I'm pretty sure this is one of the first 12 markers I've answered in terms of practice back in year 12. And I have somewhere that 12 marker that I sometimes look back to and see my progress. I think there is nothing special about this answer. It is just about being rigorous. Get here case is one of the first things you learn in epistemology. So it is quite fair to assume that a lot of people might know this topic very well. And if you want to really stand out, it's more about not making mistakes, being accurate, and getting the facts right. So, for instance, remember Smith and Jones being the names. You can't just give any names. I have gone further. I have put the date 1963, which I don't even know if it's correct. I just remember it, and yeah, I don't think it's necessary to put that. It's just showing off if it's correct. I have to check if it's correct. I haven't. But what I want to note is the language around individually necessary and jointly sufficient. So this is something that was pointed out to me in one of my previous answers to get year cases in a practice 12 mark I've written. And the feedback was to talk about the conditions as being individually necessary and jointly sufficient. And what I used to say is just necessary and sufficient conditions. They aren't necessary and sufficient conditions. They are individually necessary and jointly sufficient. Because, for instance, belief isn't sufficient to guarantee knowledge under, let's say, JTB, but it is jointly sufficient with truth and justification. Similarly, it is not that all three are necessary together, they are jointly sufficient together, but each one of them are individually necessary. Um, so that's kind of the nuance I wanted to note, and I think it's quite important. It's finally time to talk about the essay. The essay was about Berkeley's idealism, something that a lot of us didn't expect. We expected innatism. Now, I had a mock the Saturday, because I have Saturday school, of the A level exam, and in which my teacher gave three questions we could choose from to do a practice essay. And I thought to myself, well, I already have kind of a plan for innatism. Let me just try out the essay on idealism. And at the time, I didn't even have a plan for Berkeley's idealism. And it turns out that was probably the best decision ever, because if I did get idealism as an essay on the day, having not done a practice essay before, I would have probably been cooked. Mainly because again, I don't have didn't have a plan, even though I'm a person who generally doesn't have plans. I think I it might be quite obvious throughout the essay that I have kind of come up with the arguments while I was writing. Um, for instance, when it comes to solipsism and the way I've inserted it into my essay, it is if you notice, it might come across as a bit confused, but I have managed to try and turn that confusion into integration, where I would talk about the argument throughout the essay and say that, oh, if you try to respond to solipsism by saying that by talking about God as another mind aside from yours, and then I give my second argument against Berkeley, his understanding of God, attacking his understanding of God and the role that God plays in his idealism. Then I'm also attacking his response to solipsism, or I'm not sure if he gives that response to solipsism, but a possible response to solipsism, and therefore I'm attacking both solipsism. Sorry, I'm reinforcing my own argument against the master argument um, of solipsism, and also attacking Berkeley's use of God in his theory. And I think this is probably one of the biggest topics where you can talk about all of the arguments being kind of interlinked. Um, I also went, I think, a step further and talked about um, Burton Russell. Now, I am aware that there are problems. I mean, when you learn about Berkeley, you are taught the objection from hallucination and illusion. Now, I have chosen to completely not talk about illusion and briefly mention hallucination, mainly because Berkeley can simply accept hallucinations, and he can say that they are our dreams. They are dim, confused, irregular perceptions that are not from God but are from ourselves. And however ridiculous his response is, I think even engaging in that debate in this essay would have been, in my opinion, a waste of time. So therefore, I went for a stronger argument against idealism, which turned out to be a big eureka moment during the exam when I thought about this. But that was bringing Burton Russell into debate, which I think it's very unusual to do. I don't know why I thought about this. But one of the central claims of idealism is that the external mind independent world does not exist. It's only mind dependent. There only exists mind dependent objects and ideas. Now, I have kind of tweaked the language when it comes to Bertrand Russell's abductive argument for when he's making a case for the existence of the real world. And you can see it. I have put a bracket around hypothesis B, where I said, and we exist in mind dependently in the mind of God, who is the origin of all our sensations. In this case, hypothesis B is the idealist hypothesis, and with the argument that Bertrand Russell makes, we're basically just saying that this is the lesser likely hypothesis. The hypothesis that a mind independent world exists is the better hypothesis. Now, I think what I did here is quite smart. Is not only have I talked about why idealism is not likely, but it is not likely not only because it has problems within its own theory, but there are better, stronger alternatives that do not need to rely on God, and also on the other implications that come with Berkeley's idealism.
Does Berkeley's idealism give the correct account of perception as a source of knowledge? In this essay, I will argue that Berkeley's idealism does not give the correct account of perception as a source of knowledge. This is firstly because the foundational argument for Berkeley's idealism, the master argument, can both lead to idealism and solipsism, which is an unwanted conclusion. More crucially, the role of God and an over-reliance on God played in Berkeley's idealism is incredibly problematic, as it faces objections from hallucination and an incoherency with his accounts of sensations. More crucially, in this essay, I will argue, using Bertrand Russell's abductive argument, that a physical real world is the best hypothesis, shattering Berkeley's claim that there is no such thing as a physical world. In order to begin this essay, I will first outline a few ideas and definitions. Idealism, Berkeley's idealism will be the only one discussed in this essay, is the anti-realist, immaterialist theory of perception which claims that all that exists are mind-independent minds and ideas, perceivers and perceived, and that there are no mind-independent objects, and it denies the existence of an external physical world. Berkeley's foundational argument for his theory is his master argument, which he calls as such as he claims that it attacks all forms of realism. In his three dialogues, Berkeley, through the character in the book, asks us to imagine of a tree that is unperceived. However, this task is revealed to be impossible because to imagine of something is to perceive of it in the mind, and therefore the idea of a mind-independent object is contradictory, as we cannot imagine of a mind-independent object that is unperceived. He therefore claims that to be is to be perceived. In his account of why objects don't just appear or disappear, or objects seem to continue to exist even when people don't perceive them, i.e., a wax candle left in a room, everyone leaves the room, when people come back, the wax candle is shorter. Berkeley explains that all minds and ideas are constantly perceived by the infinite and powerful mind of God. And he explains that he is the origin of our sensations. In this essay, I will give reasons for why idealism is not the correct account of perception, and some of these reasons will be based on criteria for a theory of perception to be correct, not an exhaustive list. First, the account of perception best explains the way the world is and phenomena that occur. Second, the arguments for the theory of perception are valid and sound, and arguments which do not and are arguments which do not lead, even possibly, to absurd conclusions. And three, the theory of perception does not contain inconsistencies, incoherencies with other claims within the theory, and need not to rely on unfalsifiable claims. The first reason why idealism does not give the correct account of perception and is unconvincing is that the master argument also leads to solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical view that all that exists is in your mind, and every other mind and idea is part of your mind. If the master argument is true, then there is no reason for us to assume that other minds must also exist. Berkeley would reply that the alternative of solipsism can be easily ruled out because of, because of the existence of God. The existence of one other mind other than your own is enough to dismiss solipsism. We ought to note that Berkeley had other reasons why God must exist, not just as an explanation to why objects and things don't disappear and reappear. This is a problem for my challenge, as if Berkeley can provide good explanation to dismiss this alternative, then idealism is not really being threatened by my issue. However, we must notice that for any argument to be considered as convincing arguments, The very fact that it leads to two different conclusions, it shows a weakness in the argument, as Berkeley will have an additional need to explain why one over the other, and we can attack his explanation. And if shown to be unsuccessful, the problem of solipsism still stands. The issue with the role of God in his idealism will be discussed further in depth, but I want to pose a different counter challenge to Berkeley's explanation. Why does it have to be a God who is the origin of our sensations and keeps every mind and idea in its mind, but not an entirely different entity, such as an evil demon or brain in a vat? Berkeley needs to explain why God specifically, which means that idealism cannot be taken independently of accounts of God, meaning that it is reliant on the existence of God. From this exchange, we can say that Berkeley can only survive the objection from solipsism if he can explain why God is a better alternative, additionally, prove God's existence. This puts a lot of weight into the idealist metaphysical framework, which people may not find convincing, mainly because there are other theories of perceptions which do not need to rely on such explanations. This is my least crucial objection among my other arguments, precisely because it does not rule our idealism completely. It just shows it to be a complicated and reliant theory of perception. My next point, however, will focus on the problems related to the role of God in idealism and if that objection is successful and this argument is ultimately strengthened. Second reason why idealism does not give the correct account of perception and why it can be found to be an incoherent theory of perception is the role of God in Berkeley's idealism. The first issue arises with the way sensations and perceptions work in the theory, and from the specific claim that God is the origin of our sensations. Suppose I feel helpless as I am writing this essay. According to Berkeley, my sensations of helplessness must first come from God, as He is the origin of all our sensations. The question is raised that can Berkeley really accept that an omnipotent God can feel the sensation of helplessness? Does it befit the majesty of God? Furthermore, when I hit my toe in the corner of the table, I feel a sharp sensation of pain. And through the same kind of reasoning, this sensation must also come from God. Can we really say that God can feel pain? We can do this for any human sensation from helplessness, pain, and greed and anxiety. This shows that there is a damning issue with Berkeley's account of God, which is central to his idealism, where a contradiction can be said to be generated between the attributes of God and the sensations he feels. We can also discuss how God allows for certain perceptions like hallucinations. It won't be discussed as there are other more pressing objections. As Berkeley just explains, that hallucinations are dim, irregular, and confused, and are not from God but involuntary perceptions from ourselves. He compares them to dreams. Therefore, it won't serve the purpose of this essay, as Berkeley can simply accept this. Berkeley's response to this challenge is that we are misunderstanding how human sensations work and how sensations in God's mind work. Although we do not know of the exact metaphysical mechanism present in God's mind, Berkeley asserts that the way we feel pain, e.g., pain is not the same as what it is in God's mind. God cannot be said to feel pain. He knows what it is like for humans to feel pain, but it does not mean that God Himself is feeling pain. This poses a challenge to the issue I have raised against Berkeley, as it shows that there is no inherent contradiction between the attributes of God and the sensations we feel, as God does not actually feel those sensations, but rather, He knows what it is like for us humans to feel them. This is a good reply. However, a further problem with the role of God in his idealism can be pressed alongside his objection. God's mind is immutable, it does not change, but our sensations do change. I can feel happy now while I'm doing this exam, but in 10 minutes when I flip through to see the other questions, I might become depressed and sad. According to Berkeley's theory, this means that the sensation in God's mind must also change, which is a problem within the very concept for God, as God has perfect knowledge of the world. And perfect knowledge is not knowledge that changes, it is immutable by virtue. In this exchange, it can be said that Berkeley does not make an adequate job in terms of defending the role of God within his idealism. This is an extremely crucial objection, which if Berkeley can't defend himself from, it is absolutely fatal. The first reason this is extremely crucial is because what it is at stake if the role of God in idealism is contradictory. It means that Berkeley's theory of perception cannot give a convincing account of how the world is and other phenomena, as he used God to explain why things don't just pop in and out of existence. Furthermore, we can refer back to my initial solipsism objection, which part of it relies on the existence of God as evidence of existence of a further mind other than my own, to dismiss solipsism. However, if God is incompatible with idealism, then the master argument leading to solipsism becomes far more crucial, but always less than this objection because of this. And lastly, this just shows how Berkeley's account of God within his account of a theory of perception simply feels like theological patches to sustain his failing theory. The final reason why idealism does not give the correct account of perception as a source of knowledge is my most crucial and important objection against Berkeley, and is also an argument for realism, or an external physical world and mind independent objects. We can borrow from and adapt against idealism an argument Bertrand Russell makes. Bertrand Russell makes an abductive argument, a type of inductive argument where the conclusion is likely to be true because it is the best explanation, where he claims that the existence of an external mind independent world is the best explanation. We can understand his argument with two hypotheses. A, an external physical mind independent world exists. B, an external physical mind independent world does not exist, and we exist in mind depend and we exist mind independently in a mind of God, who is the origin of all our sensations. Assuming we cannot definitely prove either hypothesis A or B, we can look for which is the best explanation. Russell claims that A is a better explanation as it explains the world far better than if B were the case. He gives the example of the cat moving from one place to another. It is a far more superior explanation that a cat is not popping in and out of existence when perceived and not perceived, because a cat physically exists in a physical world, as opposed to the cat not popping in and out of existence because of the existence of some immensely powerful metaphysical entity like God. Hence, idealism is likely to be incorrect. Berkeley could object to this argument by claiming that the existence of a mind independent object is contradictory, and therefore B is a better hypothesis than A. This is supported by his master argument. We could talk about problems with the inferences we can make with the master argument, but I have sufficiently dealt with this. Rather, I want to counter this objection from Berkeley by highlighting the fact that the master argument misunderstands the idea that is being perceived with the object that is being perceived. Just because I cannot imagine an unperceived tree, it does not imply that a mind independent unperceived tree can exist. This is a flaw with conceivability tests, as the master argument is one. And this would undermine idealism to the core, as the master argument is one of Berkeley's main arguments. My thesis that a mind independent physical external world therefore survives Berkeley's master argument, and we can safely say that A is a better hypothesis than B. This is the most crucial objection with Berkeley's idealism. Firstly, because realism is a better explanation of anti-realism, which includes idealism. It highlights that idealism is likely not to be a correct account of perception. Furthermore, realist theories do not require the existence of God, especially and crucially the way idealism for Berkeley needs. Meaning that, by Occam's razor, my thesis is assuming less complex metaphysical entities than idealism. Arguably, God can be said to be the most complex metaphysical entity. So, this is more crucial argument than the rest of my arguments because I am not just showing why Berkeley is likely to be wrong, but I'm also giving a more powerful alternative. In conclusion, in this essay, I have demonstrated that Berkeley's idealism absolutely does not give the correct account of perception as a source of knowledge. Firstly, because of the foundational argument for idealism is a weak argument which faces objection that it can lead to solipsism and that it misunderstands what is being perceived and the content of perception. Something can exist even if we can't imagine it. Furthermore, Berkeley's idealism is overly reliant on the existence of God, and more crucially, there are problems with the role that God plays in the theory that he is the origin of our sensations. And lastly, more crucially, idealism is not a better alternative than realist options. And if realism is true or likely to be true, then idealism is false or likely to be false. What is moral realism? Moral realism is a meta-ethical view which claims that there exist objective, mind-independent moral properties which exist in the world. Moral realism also claims that the ethical language is cognitive, i.e., when we make moral claims, we express a belief which can be true or false. Truth act.
I don't think there is much to say about this tree marker. I think it's very clear. It is just a definition you need to know, and I mean it's very hard to go wrong as long as you have the correct understanding of moral realism.
Explain Kant's distinction between a contradiction in conception and a contradiction in will. In Kantian deontological ethics, which is a normative ethical theory which is based on duties and claims an action is right or wrong based on the action itself and not consequences or anything else. According to Kant, for something to become a moral law, i.e., a categorical imperative, moral commands which we must follow, we ought to follow them and give us as reason to follow them in itself, it must pass the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which is to act on that maxim, personal principle that guides decision making, on which you can at the same time will to become universal law. For something to pass the first formulation of the categorical imperative, it must also pass the contradiction conception. The contradiction in conception is the test to see whether a maxim can be willed to be a universal law can be failed if universalizing it would lead to a logical self-contradiction. The maxim must also pass the contradiction in will, which is the test to see whether a maxim can be willed to be a universal law can be failed if although it does not lead to a logical self-contradiction, it cannot be rationally willed, as it will prevent us from willing other means or ends. Maxims which, if negated, would fail the contradiction in conception, generate perfect duties, which are duties we can fulfill only in one way and we are obligated to fulfill them. However, maxims which, if negated, would fail the contradiction in will, generate imperfect duties, which are duties we can fulfill in more than one way and are secondary to perfect duties. This is a distinction between the contradiction in conception and contradiction in will.
I think this next question was slightly more interesting. Um, because, well, I think getting full marks in this question wasn't exactly hard, but it's about to know what is redundant and what is not redundant. And I think I was very close to being redundant and losing marks for waffling. It is very tempting when you talk about Kant to try and fit in as much information as possible. And I'm pretty sure the first few sentences of my answer was kind of that. And the examiner highlights that it is correct, but not necessary for gaining marks. I beg to differ. I think it's very important to outline at least one sentence of the Kantian theory of ethics, and also defining what the categorical imperative is. Now, the question I'm pretty sure was about differences between contradiction in will and contradiction in conception. And the main one I could think of is that, first of all, they are two different tests. So just um, listing out what the test is one difference. One works by not generating a logical self-contradiction, and the other one works by even if it does not lead to a logical self-contradiction, it cannot be rationally willed, and then you explain what it means by rationally willed. The other difference, and I think that's the one that people might miss, is that a duty that is let me just look at the wording. A maxim which, if negated, would fail the contradiction conception, generate a perfect duty. And if it negation means that it would sorry, no, anything else that is a duty, and it's not a perfect duty, it's an imperfect duty, meaning that if you negate a maxim which would fail the contradiction in will, then that will generate an imperfect duty, and then explaining the difference between the two would be your second difference. I have gotten 5 marks in this question, and again, I'm quite pleased about that.
Explain why a hedonistic utilitarian might oppose eating animals. Hedonistic act utilitarianism is a consequentialist normative ethical theory which claims that an action is right if it leads to the greatest happiness of all those who are affected. This is the principle of utility, which is the defining principle of utilitarianism, which approves and disapproves of every action. According to the act utilitarian, happiness is understood as pleasure in the absence of pain, and this can be further unpacked by the hedonic claim, which is that happiness is the only good. An example of a hedonistic act utilitarian is Jeremy Bentham, who defines utility as a property of an object in action or virtue by which it tends to produce happiness. Bentham is especially relevant as a hedonistic act utilitarian when it comes to the issue of eating animals. He makes the following claim when it comes to the moral relevance of other species. The question is not can they speak, but it is can they suffer. According to this theory, the utility of everyone is equal and should be taken into consideration when making moral decisions. This includes animals because they have sentience, the basic consciousness needed to experience pleasure and pain. They too must be considered in moral decisions, especially when it affects them. This means that a hedonistic act utilitarian may object to eating animals as the utility of the temporary pleasures from eating animals would not outweigh the disutility of the suffering and killing of animals, especially as there are 80 billion land animals annually who are in this industry and only 8 to 9 billion of us. Therefore, as it would maximize utility not to eat animals, the hedonistic act utilitarian would find it morally impermissible.
Fun fact: when answering this question, I read hedonistic act utilitarianism, so instead of just hedonistic utilitarianism. So I end up only talking about hedonistic act utilitarianism and therefore just talking about Bentham. And I did go in depth when it comes to that, and that's why I think I got full marks in that question. But usually, I think what anyone should do is talk about both rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. I know a few people who talked about preference utilitarianism, and I think they'd be wrong in doing that, mainly because preference utilitarianism is not a hedonistic form of utilitarianism, and also I know it's very tempting to talk about Peter Singer when it comes to animal rights and eating animals. I do try to quote Bentham in that five marker, and I'm pretty sure I get him wrong. And I quote him from. So I have Animal Liberation with me here. This is Peter Singer's book, and he quotes from Bentham, which is where I remember the quote from. Um, and just to flex this, the only reason I brought this out is because I want to flex this. This is actually a signed copy by Peter Singer himself. Now, in my answer, I say the question is not can they speak, but can they suffer? I think the actual quote is, let me find it. The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So I was not too far off, but also it would have been nice if I got the quote completely right. But aside from that, that was a very nice question. That's the only applied ethics we've gotten, which is very interesting, especially because we expected the essay to be applied ethics. At least a lot of people expect it to be applied ethics.
Explain Ayer's emotivism and the issue that Ayer's emotivism cannot account for how we use moral language. Ayer's emotivism is a meta-ethical theory which is anti-realist, meaning that it denies the existence of objective, mind-independent moral properties that exist in the world. Emotivism also claims that ethical language is non-cognitive, i.e. it expresses attitudes or emotions which are not truth-apt, neither true or false. Rather, the purpose of ethical language, according to the emotivist, is to influence the emotions and attitudes of others. According to emotivism, we can understand the statement murder is wrong as to mean bu murder. This is also known as the bu Hare theory, meaning that murder is wrong is neither true or false, it is merely an expression of an emotion intended to influence the emotions and attitudes of others. However, Ayer's emotivism faces an objection in terms of the fact that it cannot account for how we use moral language. Firstly, not all moral language is meant to influence others. We can take as example academic discussions which should be dispassionate. The same can be said for certain important debates. Furthermore, it can be said that this is not unique of moral language. Certain non-moral language, such as advertisements, have also the intention to influence others. Furthermore, another issue with Ayer's emotivism and his use of moral language is that it cannot account for moral reasoning. Take the following argument as an example. Premise 1. If murder is wrong, then paying someone else to murder is also wrong. Premise 2. Murder is wrong. Conclusion. Therefore, paying someone to murder is also wrong. According to the emotivist, premise 2 is a non-cognitive statement. But in premise 1, the same statement as implied by the if-then conditional structure is being used in a cognitive way. Emotivism cannot account for how we make these arguments, and this argument is valid, but it would not work if we take the account of ethical language as per the emotivists and Ayer. In summary, Ayer's emotivism is an anti-realist, non-cognitive meta-ethical theory which claims moral statements are expressions of emotions which have an intention to influence others. However, Ayer's emotivism faces problems with moral reasoning, moral language not being influencing, and examples of non-moral language being influencing. This shows that emotivism cannot account for how we use moral language.
I think there is a lot that you can talk about in this 12 marker. I was very happy when I saw it because I have practiced it quite a lot. And also, I am quite uh, involved and interested in the debate when it comes to language, emotivism, and metaethics. The first part of the 12 marker should always be explaining the theory, explaining Ayer's position, explaining emotivism. And the second part is going to be the problems emotivism has when it comes to language. Now, there are a few that I mentioned, and I think even if I focused on one, that would have been enough for full marks or like near full marks. I got 11 out of 12. I'm pretty happy with that. Now, the ones I mentioned was about moral language, non-moral language having the same effect as what the emotivist claims that moral language has, that it influences emotions in other people, and also the fact that in certain situations you do not want moral language to be passionate and involve the influencing of other people's emotions. And the example I gave is the fact that in academic discussions you do not want to have that effect. Now, I think the strongest argument, and you shouldn't say this in a 12 marker because there should be no evaluation, but when it comes to emotivism, the biggest problem um, with regards to language is the fact that you cannot make logical arguments. And when you try to do that, you come into a problem of the fact that you cannot do the deductions. And I give an example of an argument which goes as follows. Um, if sorry, the first premise would be that if murder is wrong, then paying someone else to murder is also going to be wrong. Murder is wrong, therefore paying someone else to murder someone is wrong. Now, by the structure of the statement, which is a conditional if then, you cannot you cannot at the same time translate that the way the Hare theory wants and also make a logical deduction. I think there is a better formulation of this problem, and it's known as the Frege problem. I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's a very strong problem. This is way beyond the A-level specification, but Simon Blackburn, who's a very famous philosopher, and he's also the author of the book Think, which a lot of people might be introduced to when they first come into philosophy. He is what I think he still is right now, a quasi-realist, and he tries to solve the Frege problem. Now, a year ago, I'd probably be able to talk about this bit more. Now, I'm not as refreshed on the topic, so I can't really right now. And I'd advise to look up his quasi-realism and also his response to the Frege problem. I'm pretty sure at the time I was not convinced to his reply, but as of now, I can't really articulate why, mainly because I don't remember much. So this was the essay I scored the least. I got 20 out of 25, which is still top band, which is still really good. I thought I did really good in this essay, and it is the essay I performed uh, the worst in. And I mean, it's the Aristotle essay. It was quite unexpected. I think I did have a lot of practice in class, and also I am quite confident in Aristotelian virtue ethics. But I think the issue here might be that it is one of the, let's say, at the same time, easier um, theory to talk about, but also when it comes to accuracy and precision is the one you have to be a lot careful about. And when it comes to making arguments, especially if you haven't planned your essay, and I very much recommend to plan your essay and not put yourself in my position where I had to think about a lot of the arguments on the way. I think overall I did a pretty good job. Now, the arguments I make is the arguments I can remember when it comes to virtue ethics. The first time I tried to write a virtue ethics essay, I started out with defending Aristotle, and then midway thinking about, hold on, I don't really like this, and then I changed my whole essay into an anti-Aristotelian virtue ethics essay. The argument is made by Christine Swanton when she gives two examples. The one I can remember is about um, the the aid worker or the medic who's been working away and has been working long hours in terrible conditions, and then she contracts a disease and dies prematurely, but she led her whole life in accordance to virtue. But can we really say that she died as a eudaimon? That would not be something that we would say, because she died a miserable life, even though she lived in accordance to virtue. And that medic has definitely sacrificed their own well-being for the sake of others or for the sake of virtue. I think this is very much a strong argument. I don't know why the examiner chose to give me a cross for it. I don't know what it means. It might be that I made a mistake earlier, but to me, I'm still perplexed to where I may have gone wrong. Now there is nothing much I can talk about in this essay. Um, I am quite happy about it. One thing to note is that you can always talk about meta ethics when you're evaluating a normative ethical theory. In my first draft of this essay, I blanked. I didn't know what to talk about. I couldn't remember the objections against Aristotle. So I just attacked naturalist. Was it naturalist? Yeah, I attacked a form of realism, naturalist realism, and because Aristotelian virtue ethics is a more realist, naturalist, um, I think it's non-reductionist naturalist theory, I would get away with attacking it that way. And I think actually attacking normative ethical theories through meta ethics might be something really good. It is just that there are so many other objections to normative ethical theories that you learn. Often there is no time or there is no point in talking about meta ethics, but it is always something to note. And also it might be something for you to encourage yourself to learn meta ethics, such that it can become this backup or like this safety net when it comes to essays and normative ethical theories. Is Aristotelian virtue ethics the correct normative ethical view? In this essay, I will argue that virtue ethics is not the correct normative ethical theory. This is because virtue ethics and Aristotle fail to make a distinction between the good for the individual and the moral good. Furthermore, a more crucial objection comes from the possible clashes between virtues, which can show virtue ethics to not be a good approach to ethics. Most crucially, Aristotle's theory, although it can be said to have an agent centered approach which best captures the complexity of human life and allows for much needed nuance, this concession allows for a lack of clear guidance within the theory, from how virtues and a virtuous person are defined to the way we gain our moral education. And this is a very crucial objection. Virtue ethics is a normative ethical theory which is agent centered, meaning that an action is right if a virtuous person is disposed to do that action. It focuses on the moral agent as opposed to the nature of the action. Aristotle gives a function argument, which is the argument to explain that in order to fulfill our final and end goal of eudaimonia, living and faring well, one must fulfill the characteristic activity, which is rational activity, which includes practical reasoning. Reasoning and reason concern with what we can change, and theoretical reasoning and reason concern with what we cannot change. Traits that enable us to fulfill our characteristic activity, ergon function, are virtues, arete, which are stable traits of character, dispositions to feel, think, and act in appropriate ways in appropriate situations. In his account of how we gain virtues and become virtuous, Aristotle draws an analogy between practical skills and virtues. Practical skills are said to be like virtues because we're not born with them, and we gain them not just by learning the theory but by actually practicing the action of virtue. One does not learn how to play the lyre by acquiring knowledge about lyre playing, but by actually doing the activity, i.e., lyre playing. Similarly, one does not learn to become virtuous by just acquiring knowledge about being virtuous, but by doing good acts and practicing being virtuous. Therefore, we become virtuous through habituation, making virtuous habits stable traits of our character. In both cases, having a role model or teacher can help us acquire those virtues or practical skills by emulating them. Aristotle, to clarify his account of virtues, gives the doctrine of the mean, which is that virtues lie intermediary between vices of excess and vices of deficiency. E.g., the virtue of courage lies between the vice of foolhardiness, excess, and the vice of cowardice, deficiency. He also claims that the mean is relative to us, and it is relative to the circumstance. The mean for a firefighter to save someone from a fire and display the virtue of courage lies differently from where the virtue of courage lies in the mean of an elderly man who happens to be there. The first reason why virtue ethics is not the correct normative ethical theory is because it fails to make a crucial distinction between what is good for the individual and what is moral good. We ought to recall that Aristotle claims that eudaimonia is our final and end goal, and that traits that help us reach eudaimonia are virtues. And virtues are the actions that a virtuous person is predisposed to do. We can illustrate the problem with the following scenario. Imagine a person living in a brutal dictatorship. For them to do the virtuous act to protest and display the virtues of courage may result to harm or even death for them. This shows that displaying virtues can come in opposition to what is good for an individual, as a person needs to make a sacrifice which may very much include their own well-being. This objection is a problem for Aristotle as it highlights that we need to draw a line between the good for an individual and the moral good. Additionally, we can say that not all virtues contribute to eudaimonia, because can we really say that a person who's sacrificing their well-being, potentially to torture and death, to display such virtues, their life is one of an eudaimon? Have they really prospered and fared well? In response to this objection, Aristotle and other virtue ethicists may claim that what in the case of the courageous person, it is the case that it is incredibly courageous for the person to take action. And furthermore, there is a need in such society to stand up to oppression. If no one does it, then it runs the risk that people's ability to develop virtues is going to be inhibited, partly because the state plays a role in a child's moral education and training. However, another possible reply could be that the virtue of courage lies differently for that person. I.e., it should not be them to protest, but someone else who can afford to do it, e.g., they can escape the country. Although these objections capture the nuanced nature and context-sensitive nature of virtue ethics, we can counter these replies with the fact that if a distinction is not drawn, then the problem still stands. A normative ethical theory cannot absolutely afford to allow for the agent to sacrifice their own well-being. The very thing a normative ethical theory is meant to set out guidelines to protect. This exchange shows that Aristotelian virtue ethics does have persuasive elements, but it is unsuccessful in doing what a normative ethical theory should do. Hence, it is not a convincing approach to ethics. Furthermore, An additional reason why Aristotelian virtue ethics is not a convincing approach to ethics and therefore not a correct normative ethical theory is because it does not answer properly the question of what happens if two virtues clash. For example, what if displaying the virtue of courage clashes with the virtue of temperance? For example, if an evil king threatens a rule of another country, the rule of the country can choose to display the virtue of courage as supposed to be temperate and not display anger, by choosing to go to war. We can note that Aristotle did claim that killing in war is justified. This is a problem for Aristotelian virtue ethics as it highlights an apparent inability for a normative ethical theory to guide people, which again does not look good on a normative ethical theory. Aristotle could reply that virtues can never clash and would appeal to the doctrine of the mean, that the mean is relative based on person and circumstance. For instance, in this scenario, it could be the case that the mean of courage and the mean of temperance allows for the ruler to do these actions. We can reply to Aristotle in two similar ways, the first of which will be discussed later, and that is this is susceptible to the problem of lack of clear guidance, and that this is an example of that. Second way, we can reply to this response is by highlighting that Aristotle's response is unfalsifiable. No matter what we say or scenario we give, Aristotle can always say that we misunderstand where the mean is, quite conveniently, where there is no clash. This is a crucial issue for Aristotle because we can give an infinite amount of variations of scenarios where there are clashing virtues, and if it is the case that we misunderstand them because we don't understand or know or can identify where the mean is, then it tells something about the approach of the normative ethical theory not being adequate, as identifying our mean for our actions allows us to feel the right passions at the right time and reference the right objects with the right motives, and identifying or having a general conception where the mean for others lie allows us to identify whether someone has acted wrongly, and for someone who is, for instance, a judge, bestow the correct punishments. This is more crucial than the first argument specifically because of this. A normative ethical theory not only should safeguard our well being, but it should set out guidelines for society to function such that everyone has their well being. But if there are clashes in duties, then we cannot function morally. And if there are not clashes in duties, even when we feel like there is, it makes moral consideration unintuitive and complicated, especially in the context of law and justice when identifying someone who acted wrongly. Lastly, my most crucial argument against Aristotelian virtue ethics, and why I find it to be an incorrect normative ethical theory, is that there is a lack of clear guidance. As an agent centered normative ethical theory, virtue ethics does not set out to give rules and guidelines which we ought to follow, but rather a general doctrine to understand that our action need to be judged case by case based on what the virtuous person would do. However, there is a circularity between the definition of virtuous person and virtuous act. A virtuous person is a person disposed to do virtuous acts, and a virtuous act are acts that a virtuous person is disposed to do. As A is defined in terms of B and B in terms of A, no new transfer of information is there, and other than the fact that A may be related to B, we do not have any independent criteria to identify either A or B. And if we don't know who the virtuous person is, how can someone who is not virtuous emulate them? This is a major problem for Aristotle, as he would suggest that his virtue ethics cannot truly account for how someone can become virtuous. To add to this, the mean in the doctrine of the mean is not an arithmetic mean, one which can be calculated. This also supports my previous objection with clashing virtues. So how can we always reliably figure them out for ourselves and others? Aristotle would reply that moral education or training happens through one's family, law or state, or public education as they all play a part. And we can use the words of another virtue ethicist, Julius Annis, we do not live in a vacuum. We learn from the standards and values and culture around us. Furthermore, Aristotle would say that the Phronimus, Phronimus, virtuous person is most likely the one to reach out to the non-virtuous person, e.g., a virtuous parent to a not yet virtuous child. This is a problem for my challenge as it would suggest that Aristotle's account of moral education and training can account for how one develops morally, and hence there isn't actually a lack of clear guidance from the circularity objection. And to answer the objection from the doctrine of the mean, Aristotle would say that we need to develop our practical wisdom, which is an intellectual virtue related to practical reasoning, which allows us to identify the constitutive means to virtuous actions. And we can always ask the question, how can I be virtue X? How can I be more virtue X? E.g., courageous in this situation. However, this reply, although quite nicely captures Aristotle's view of moral education, something very important for normative ethical theory to have an opinion and guidance on, we can say that this is overly idealistic. First, we can go back to the initial example of living under a dictatorship, which a lot of countries even today live under. If public education, which is supposedly something that should aid our moral education, cannot help us and rather inhibits the development of our virtue as an example, what does Aristotle have to say about situations where developing virtues are impossible because of, e.g., no parents, bad society, bad laws, and government? This final counter successfully undermines Aristotle's argument on moral education and training as a response to my initial objection and lack of clear guidance. This is my most crucial objection, partly because the first two examples can also be said to be examples of a lack of clear guidance, so this is the crux of this objection. In conclusion, Aristotelian virtue ethics cannot be said to be convincing and therefore is not the correct normative ethical view, as it does not have the correct approach to morality. Firstly, because it allows us to sacrifice our moral well being in order to display virtues which, according to him, lead to eudaimonia. But there are cases which are not making a distinction between what is good for an individual and the moral good, which imply that aren't going to live and fare well. Furthermore, a more crucial objection comes with clashing virtues, which is a problem for normative ethical theory because it highlights an inability for moral agents to make moral decisions. And finally, the most crucial and damning objection to Aristotelian virtue ethics is a lack of clear guidance from the definitions given for virtuous person and virtuous acts and a doctrine of the mean, where it is hard for us to identify the correct means. Therefore, in this essay, I have shown that this normative ethical theory that is meant to safeguard our well-being, not us to sacrifice it, is meant to guide us and give us clear guidance, and it quite does not. This was a nice 3 marker. I got 3 out of 3. There isn't much to say about it. I think it's something you just need to know. What is meant by spatial order in Paley's design argument? Spatial order refers to the orderliness of things in space, how things are arranged in space, and the organization of parts to fit a purpose. In his design argument from spatial order, Paley refers to how the organization of parts of, e.g., the structures of the eye, fit a specific purpose, e.g., enable vision. There are so many LARPers that try to LARP philosophy, and it really angers me when they try to talk about the paradox of the stone as if it was a gotcha. I've had so many WhatsApp debates with random people from my school, people, family members, and people I just know, and they think the question, can God create a stone so heavy he himself cannot lift, is such a gotcha that, oh wow, I'm an atheist now. This is so convincing. I think it's one of those things that it just makes me happy that I have taken up this A level, taken up an interest in philosophy, just so I can see, if I didn't take an interest in philosophy, I might have ended up like them. Now, this question is all about the paradox of the stone. It's about explaining it, so you don't reply to the paradox of the stone. That's a separate topic, and I think I did a pretty good job. I got full marks in that question. I really like not always writing in prose, but sometimes stopping and like just labeling things, like labeling sentence one or sentence two, and then writing one in brackets or writing one or two in brackets when you refer back to them. The same thing back when I talked about Bertrand Russell's abductive argument. I labeled my hypothesis as A and B, and instead of writing them over and over and again, I just wrote A and B. And I think doing this is something, it's a good habit, in my opinion. And also, it makes your writing look less like, con- like dense in a certain sense. And also, I think I like writing this way much more. If someone is interested to possible answers to the paradox of the stone, then I am very much more than happy to talk about this. I think it's a very interesting topic, but also something that no religious person is actually worried about. No one thinks that question is actually worth engaging in philosophically. It's been, I mean, if you want to challenge someone, a religious person, on the coherency of God, you're going to have much more success with something like Euthyphus dilemma, as opposed to the paradox of the stone. Explain the paradox of the stone. The paradox of the stone is an argument against the coherency of God, which seeks to challenge the concept of an omnipotent God. Omnipotence is understood by many philosophers to mean perfect power, the ability to do all that which is logically possible to do, and some philosophers may also argue that an omnipotent being cannot be and is not limited by anything. The paradox of the stone may be posed as a question. Can an omnipotent God create a stone so heavy he himself cannot lift? There are two possible answers that one could give to answer the question. 1. Yes, an omnipotent God can create a stone so heavy he himself cannot lift. 2. No, an omnipotent God cannot create a stone so heavy he himself cannot lift. Both possible answers are undesirable for the theist, because one suggests that if God creates such stone, then he is not powerful enough to lift the stone, so he is no longer omnipotent. 2 implies that God lacks the ability to create such stone, and lacking such an ability means that God does not have perfect power. In both cases, both answers lead to the conclusion that such being cannot be omnipotent, and thus challenge the very idea of an omnipotent God, and therefore challenges the coherency of God. Now, at this point of the paper, I get to my third 5 marker, and I read the 5 mark and I get really excited because I love religious language. The whole topic, it's really hard. I think it's one of the hardest topics in the A level, but it's so rewarding understanding it really well. And there is stuff that I can take away and apply it elsewhere in my life. Certain concepts I can use like the concept of something being unfalsifiable. I just think it's such a useful thing to know and be able to articulate when you're talking to someone and pointing out to them that what they're saying is unfalsifiable. It just so rewarding to me, and I think it's something. It's a concept that I treasure, and I'm glad that I have learned because it is really good. It's nothing special. The concept isn't something new. It is the articulation, the ability to articulate it, and knowing it has an application, like in religious language. Now, you have to talk about both flu and hair, which I do, and I also plugged in the phrase "dies a death of a thousand qualifications." I think it's one of the top five most oracle quotes in A-level philosophy. I don't know from who it comes from, probably from Flew himself. Um, but yeah, I think the parable of the dawn is something really easy to wrap your head around. It might be an extreme example, but that's the whole point. There is an examiner comment here, and that is that I could be more developed on what makes a religious statement meaningful for Hare. I mean, I'm not sure how I could do that. I think I did enough. I did do enough. I got full marks in that question. But I'd be interested on how to do that. Maybe perhaps adding one more sentence explaining what the blick is and what it means to Hare might have been ideal, but I am satisfied with my answer. Explain how Hare responds to Flew's view on religious language. Flew claims that religious language is unfalsifiable. Something is unfalsifiable when there is no such thing that one could say to make a person withdraw a certain statement. It dies a death of a thousand qualifications. And the negation of the statement, e.g., God does not exist, is as meaningful as the statement itself. Flew claims that because religious language is unfalsifiable, it then must be meaningless. Hare responds to Flew with the parable of the dawn. Suppose a very paranoid student, who is utterly scared that dons in the university want to harm him. A good friend of the student who wants to show that not all dons are bad and are there to harm him sets up a meeting with the student and the don, and this don is not trying to harm the student and is actually quite pleasant. The friend of the paranoid student says to the student that, see, not all dons want to harm you. But the student still remains paranoid and skeptical about dons. With this analogy, Hare accepts that religious language is unfalsifiable, but disagrees with Flew on whether just because it is unfalsifiable it also means it is meaningless. The student has a blick, which is what Hare refers to as a non-cognitive attitude that shapes someone's worldview that is not held on the basis of empirical evidence. The student's blick about the dons radically shapes how the student behaves and acts, so it is not appropriate, Hare says, to say that the blicks are meaningless. And the same idea can be applied about religious language and the blicks religious people have. Explain the Kalam argument and explain the issue of the possibility of an infinite series. William Lane Craig popularized a cosmological argument called the Kalam argument. The Kalam argument is an a posteriori deductive cosmological argument which argues from temporal order. Effects do not precede causes. Craig's argument can be set out as follows. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. And conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. Lane Craig then argues that there are two types of explanations: scientific explanations and personal explanations. A personal explanation for the cause of the universe is more appropriate than a scientific explanation for the cause of the universe because scientific explanations presuppose natural laws which are already within the universe. Lane Craig therefore argues that this personal explanation, e.g., an explanation in terms of agents and intentions, For example, this 12 marker answer exists because I choose to write it, leads to the fact that this explanation must that an immensely powerful being must have been responsible for the cause of the universe, and that is God. It is worth noting that Craig's justification to arrive at God is because he explains that an infinite regress of causal events is not possible. If the cause of the universe was another cause and so on to infinity, this is according to Craig impossible, as he supports by giving explanations of paradoxes of actual infinities. For example, if you have a library with an infinite number of books, half of the books being red and the other half being blue, the number of red books is the same as the total number of books in the library. However, we can object to Craig's reliance on the claim that infinite regress of causal chains is impossible by appealing to the possibility of an infinite series. For instance, Hume would claim that an infinite series of causal events is impossible is not an analytic statement, meaning that we cannot know the truth value of the proposition in virtue of the meaning of the words, and moreover we can conceive the negation of this proposition without bringing about any contradiction. And as Hume argues, anything that can be distinctly conceived without contradiction is logically possible. Furthermore, we could again challenge Craig's assertion about the impossibility of infinite series by drawing on the works of the mathematician Georg Cantor, whose work on the concept of infinity is widely accepted, who shows that infinite series are possible, at least in mathematics, and mathematicians like himself claim that we cannot apply our intuitions about the concept of infinity to actual infinities, i.e., the paradox about the library uses our common sense intuitions about infinity and therefore is not an appropriate use of the concept of infinity. In summary, William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument is a deductive a posteriori argument that argues from the existence of causation to the existence of a being who first caused the universe, and he justifies the fact this partly because an infinite chain of causal events is impossible. This claim can be challenged by empiricists like Hume, who would claim that because we can conceive of actual infinities or actual infinite series without bringing about a contradiction, infinite series are possible. And mathematicians may argue that we cannot apply our common sense intuitions about infinities to the actual world.
If seeing the second 5 marker made me really happy, seeing the 12 marker made me the happiest person in that exam hall. Mainly because there is no one who has been more obsessed when it comes to the Kalam cosmological argument for the past 2 years in my year other than me. I used to absolutely love the cosmological argument from William and Craig, until I actually learnt about its responses and its nuances, from which then my liking of the argument based on the argument changed from appreciating the argument but also understanding it is not that good of an argument. But it's also, and I think that's something I personally believe in. If you're having a quick conversation with someone and they ask you out of nowhere, "Prove to me God exists," 9 times out of 10, reciting the Kalam cosmological argument is enough to like make someone think a lot. Um, and I think that's all you need in a conversation to make someone think. But the responses to the Kalam cosmological arguments aren't that hard to figure out. I mean, the question the 12 marker is talking about, the response to the possibility of an infinite series, I don't think is a good one. And in the 12 marker, I explain that I use Hume's classical response to anything of the sort, that and if something is not analytic, then its negation, if its negation does not bring about contradiction, then it can't be impossible. So to say that infinite regress is impossible, infinite regress of causal events is impossible, it's not an analytic statement. We cannot come to the truth value of this proposition based on the virtue of the meanings of the words itself, but we need to experience the way the world is to actually come to a conclusion about the truth value of this proposition. Therefore, we cannot say that an infinite regress of causal events is impossible. I think this is not a good reply. I could go into why I think this is not a good reply. I just think that if I started talking about this, I would probably lose everyone's interest. If someone is even got to this point, which I'd be quite surprised. Now, I also brought in Gail Cantor. I don't know why I did that. I think in one of my revision sheets, Gail Cantor was mentioned. Now, he is someone who worked on set theory. I think he also worked on the quadratic, the cubic, and polynomials in general. Now, he is a very important figure in mathematics, and he did work on infinity, especially on like the concept of cardinality, different infinities having different sizes, and it's a very fascinating topic. The point that I try to make is that we cannot apply our intuitions of infinity to the real world because we don't understand infinity that well. And that might be a really good point. I am not that sure that it comes from Georg Cantor. You might extrapolate it from him and mathematicians like him. I probably went too hard on attributing it to Georg Cantor. I think later on is when I realized, did he even have an interest in this debate? I don't think so. And I don't think that's the point. Having said that, I think I also don't think this is a good reply either, because we are concerned with actual infinities, not potential infinities. Mathematical infinities, they do exist. No one is questioning that. No one is questioning. Everyone knows that there are certain infinities that converge and diverge, and certain infinities that exist in mathematics. I mean, you can construct any infinite series, and that is there. That's a thing that exists. What that then itself is a debate, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that that exists. But what we are concerned with is actual infinities. And there's a conversation I had with this one person who asked me about, imagine a ball that is expanding to infinity. After, I mean, after an infinite amount of time, where do you think you'll be? And to which I replied, I wouldn't be anywhere because all the space would be taken up by this expanding ball. Which goes on to show how, I mean, there's a bajillion ways you can answer this question. I just think that, well, actual infinities do not exist and cannot exist. And if I think hard enough, I can think about a way that this actually, to negate this, brings about contradiction. And even if it doesn't, I still think actual infinities cannot exist. And the cosmological argument, especially when it comes to when it talks about an infinite chain of causal events, that is an actual infinity, because events are real things. They exist in the world. They're not conceptual like mathematical infinities. Having said that, I was really happy with this 12 marker. I think I got a 10 out of 12. I personally think I should have gotten higher, but that is just my ego, and yeah, I'm really happy. There's only one thing that could have made me even happier than I was already when it came to this paper, and that is that we get an ontological argument essay. Actually, my favorite types of argument, everyone knows this, is the cosmological argument for the existence of God. But I am happy with the ontological argument coming up as a 25 marker, simply because it was the predicted one and because I put a lot of hard work into it. The first draft I made of this essay was really bad. That's because I tried to fit in so much information I think my teacher pointed out that it's simply not feasible to talk about Descartes, Anselm, Gaunilo, Norman Malcolm, Plantinga, and other, ontological arguments. Like Gödel has its own ontological argument. We don't learn in A-level philosophy, and I would not even mention it. What I did is I removed Descartes, mainly because I don't think it would help. He would add to my point of ontological arguments are trash. Now, there was a point in my life where I thought the ontological arguments were actually really, really good. I no longer hold that view, but I think there's lots of nuance. We should not be quick to judge ontological arguments. And often when I see people try to debunk ontological arguments, I don't think they do a good job of it. Now, my arguments are twofold. You can either argue for non-modal arguments, and then you fall into the problem of if your Anselm Gaunilo hits you quite hard, you might argue that Gaunilo is being disingenuous, sure, but you're still begging the question. And even so, Kant's argument, well, it's not really an argument, Kant pointing out that existence is not predicate is a really strong reply. And you can't really escape from that. If you try to escape from that, running to modal logic, which is a different framework of logic, which is concerned with necessity and possibility, then you, like the way Norman Malcolm does and Plantinga does. And on that point, Malcolm does argue or claim that he is inspired by Anselm's proslogium, and that's why he changes existence to necessary existence. That's the object that he's arguing for. Now, I do think I love modal logic. I think it's one of the coolest things ever. But although there are stronger arguments than non-modal arguments, they still fail, or at least they are still attacked a lot by Bertrand Russell and Hume. Hume is everywhere. You cannot escape Hume, especially in A-level philosophy. He is just everywhere. You just need to accept the fact that he's going to come up everywhere. Now, it's the same points about, first of all, applying the term necessary to a being, an entity. That does not make sense. Necessary is a term, it's a logical term that applies to logic and propositional logic and statements, propositions, not entities and beings. That's to quote to quote Bertrand Russell, it's a highly inappropriate use of the term. Now, this is actually a point that he does not make with regard to ontological arguments, but he makes with regard to cosmological arguments. And he makes this point in a debate with Copleston, who is arguing for cosmological arguments. Because in cosmological arguments, in the form that Copleston is putting forward against Bertrand Russell, he has some form of contingency argument. He argues of proving God's necessary existence, or God being the necessary being. And Bertrand Russell makes this point. And I think this can be applied to ontological arguments, because especially modal ontological arguments. Now, when it comes to Hume, now he makes the same point that, it's the same point. If the negation of the proposition does not lead to a contradiction, then you that thing is conceivable. So let's say Mahdi has 5 fingers. Actually, that's not a good example. Mahdi is a tall, handsome individual, is something that we can negate. We can negate that, and to negate that, we would be saying Mahdi is not tall and handsome. And because we can't conceive of Mahdi not being tall and handsome, because Mahdi is tall and handsome, therefore it is impossible for Mahdi to be tall, not to be tall and handsome. However, let's say in a unfair, wrong, evil world, Mahdi is tall and handsome, but we can conceive of Mahdi not being tall and handsome, then it would be possible for Mahdi to be not tall and handsome. I think that's a very bad example I gave, but it's the one that came up first in my thoughts. Now, moving on, Plantinga is probably the harder one to object to, mainly because his argument is probably the most modern argument, and also it's quite a good argument. He employs modal logic, and he improves on a Norman Malcolm by not explicitly relying on a definition of God, which is way too, you know, way too positive. His definition of God is a maximally great being, which is also in the positive. Actually, when it comes to definitions of God in ontological arguments, I think Anselm is the one who gets the prize because his definition is the one who is the most ambiguous but at the same time clear, than that which nothing greater can be conceived of. And I swear to God, I've said that so many times throughout the whole course, than that which nothing can be greater can be conceived of, that I just my brain stops doing anything else and focuses on saying that, and sometimes I still get it wrong. But yeah, my argument is that my thesis at least is that wherever you go, wherever argument you make, whether you whether you argue with a modal argument or non-modal argument, either way you're cooked. Now, I think I did a good job with that. I got 23 out of 25. I am very, very pleased with that. And I know someone who got full marks on this essay and had quite literally a similar line of reasoning with that I had. But yeah, I am pretty happy with this.
Can the ontological argument be successfully defended? In this essay, I will argue that ontological arguments for the existence of God cannot be defended. Although Anselm can defend himself from Gaudine's perfect island objection, his ontological argument can be dismissed based on Kant's objection that existence is a predicate. In this essay, I will also argue that modal ontological arguments like Malcolm's and Plantinga's are stronger than non-modal ontological arguments like Anselm's because of their use of modal logic. However, ultimately, they also fail. Malcolm's argument is crucially weaker than Plantinga's argument because it commits the fallacy of composition, and his argument relies on the concept of God heavily. Plantinga's argument also ultimately fails because of empiricist objections such as from Hume and Russell about the idea of a necessary being an incoherent concept. And this is my second most crucial argument as it applies to almost all modal arguments. And my most crucial argument is ontological arguments ultimately beg the question and hence are invalid. In order to begin this essay, I will first outline a few key definitions and arguments that I will frequently use and discuss throughout the essay. Ontological arguments are a priori deductive arguments which argue from the nature, ontology of God to the existence of God. The first ontological argument that I will be discussing is Anselm's ontological argument, which can be found in his proslogium. It is worth noting that throughout this essay, multiple ontological arguments will be discussed, and each argument tends to have a slightly different definition for God. For Anselm, God is than that which nothing greater can be conceived of. TTWNGCF. Premise 1. I have the concept of than that which nothing greater can be conceived of in my mind. Premise 2. It is greater to exist in the mind and in reality than just in the mind. Conclusion 1. Therefore, in order for than that which nothing greater can be conceived of to be truly than that which nothing can be conceived of, it must both exist in the mind and in reality. Conclusion 2. Therefore, than that which nothing greater can be conceived of exists. Conclusion 3. The being than that which nothing greater can be conceived of, we call God.
To illustrate what it means to have a concept in the mind and then both in the mind and reality, Anselm gives the example of a painter who has an idea of a painting in the mind. Then after the painter finishes the painting both exists in the mind as an idea and in reality as in the painting. As an objection to Anselm, I will be discussing the monk Gaunilo's parody objection to Anselm, which is a reductio ad absurdum argument, where he is trying to show that using similar premises to Anselm's ontological argument lead to absurd conclusions when applied to other things like an island. Premise 1. I have an idea of the greatest conceivable island. Premise 2. It is greater for something to exist in a mind and in the world as opposed to just in the mind. Conclusion. Therefore, the greatest conceivable island exists. This is, of course, as Gaunilo explains, an absurd conclusion, as no such thing does exist. The next two ontological arguments that will be discussed employ a form of logic called modal logic, where they use the logical terms of necessity and possibility. The first of these arguments is Malcolm's. Premise 1. Malcolm defines God as infinite, unlimited being. Premise 2. Either God exists or he does not exist. Premise 3. If God exists, then he cannot go out of existence. Conclusion 1. If God exists, he must exist necessarily. Premise 4. If God does not exist, then he cannot come into existence. Conclusion 2. If God does not exist, his existence is impossible. Conclusion 3. Therefore, God's existence is either necessary or impossible. Premise 5. God's existence is only impossible if the concept of God is incoherent. Premise 6. The concept of God is not incoherent. Conclusion 4. Therefore, God's existence is necessary. The next modal argument discussed would be Alvin Plantinga's argument, in which he defines God as a maximally great being who has all great making properties and lacks lesser making properties. Premise 1. It is possible for a maximally great being to exist in a possible world. Premise 2. If it is possible for a maximally great being to exist in a possible world, then he must exist in all possible worlds in order to be truly maximally great. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then because the actual world is part of the set of all possible worlds, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Conclusion 1. Therefore, a maximally great being must exist in the actual world. The first reason we can object to Anselm is because Gaunilo's parody argument shows that Anselm's argument is invalid. However, Anselm could respond to Gaunilo by claiming that his argument is disanalogous. Firstly, it is not clear what makes an island great. Such qualities are subjective. For example, someone may prefer palm trees as part of the greatest island, but someone else may prefer trees of other kinds only. However, when it comes to qualities of God, hardly anyone disagrees about God's attributes like omnipotence. Therefore, Anselm could say that ontological arguments do not apply to contingent things like islands or pizzas, because they have parts which could have been different, and they don't have an intrinsic maximum, like the concept of a necessary being that God has. However, even if we accept that Gaunilo's objection is disanalogous to Anselm's ontological argument, we could claim that Anselm misses out on the underlying point of Gaunilo's objection, that is, one cannot define things into existence. Just because we can conceive of something that must exist, it does not mean that thing must actually exist. This is ultimately begging the question, which is a logical fallacy. Anselm could reply that firstly, he is not assuming that which nothing greater can be conceived of to be existing, but rather he can just conceive of the that which nothing greater can be conceived of. And his argument leads to the existence of than that which nothing greater can be conceived of. This exchange between Galileo and Anselm is quite crucial because it shows a fatal flaw within Anselm's ontological argument. And although Anselm can show the island argument to be a straw man and disanalogous to ontological arguments like his, he does not deal well with the issue about begging the question, and he misunderstands existence as you cannot define things into existence. This point of Anselm misunderstanding the idea of existence in his ontological argument is further amplified by Kant, who claims that existence is not a predicate, i.e., it does not describe or add to the concept of the subject. He gives the example of 100 thalers, the currency of the day. Suppose one has 100 thalers and they are in their pockets, and 100 thalers as an idea in their mind. Both 100 thalers have the same value and are not different conceptually. The only difference is that 100 thalers in the mind do not exist and 100 thalers in the pocket of the person do exist. Because God's existence does not add anything to the concept of God, existence is not a predicate. A defender of ontological arguments could claim that 100 thalers that do exist and 100 thalers that don't exist are actually different. Kant could not pay his groceries with the concept of 100 thalers in his mind, but he can pay for his groceries with 100 thalers in his pockets. However, this response misses the point Kant is making about existence being a predicate. That is, existence does not add to the concept of God the same way being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent would. Kant's objection deals a fatal blow to Anselm's argument because it essentially highlights the fact that he used the term existence in an erroneous way. But moreover, this objection is especially crucial in the light that it can attack any ontological argument that assume existence as a predicate, and that goes for all known mortal arguments. However, Norman Malcolm's ontological argument and Plantinga's ontological argument do not assume existence as a predicate and therefore avoid Kant's objection that existence is a predicate. Malcolm accepts that what Kant is saying, but he notes that necessary existence is indeed a predicate, and it does add to the concept of God, as for something to exist necessarily, it must mean it exists in all possible worlds and not just in the actual world. Malcolm argues that in the third chapter of the Proslogium, Anselm does allude to the idea of necessary existence and takes inspiration from Anselm for his own ontological argument. This is a particular strength of modal arguments which make this move arguing for God's necessary existence. Therefore, any non-modal argument will be weaker in comparison to any modal argument. However, we can object to Malcolm's ontological argument on the basis of his premise that the concept of God is coherent in premise 6. There are many issues with the concept of God: the paradox of the stone, which attacks God's omnipotence, Euthyphro's dilemma, which attacks the concept of an omnibenevolent being, and problems with free will and omniscience for God. However, Malcolm could reply that there are many satisfactory answers to all of these problems with the concept of God, and ontological arguments can be formulated in ways that do not need to rely on the concept of God, i.e. Plantinga. For instance, we can always appeal to mystery when it comes to the nature of God, as we are discussing a different metaphysical entity, of which metaphysics we have little to no knowledge of. This is an extremely weak response, as his ontological argument is reliant on the concept of God. Hence, any attack on God's coherency with his attributes is an attack on God's existence through Malcolm's ontological argument. However, the argument still remains deductively valid, so although this objection is very crucial, it is possible to have a very long and separate debate about the coherency of God, and a theist may be able to give convincing replies. To avoid this, I will give another objection to Malcolm's argument. Malcolm commits the fallacy of equivocation, which is when a term which has different meanings, is used in the same way in different places of the argument, or vice versa. It can be argued that Malcolm uses the term necessary in the logical sense in his premises, but then uses the term necessary in his conclusion as to mean a necessary truth. Therefore, Malcolm confuses ontological necessity with logical necessity. Because this is a fallacy, this renders the argument completely invalid. The two objections above clearly show that Malcolm's ontological argument cannot be defended and are both crucial, with the fallacy of composition. With the fallacy of composition objection being more crucial precisely because it shows the argument to be invalid, whereas the objection of over-reliance on the concept of God, atheists could engage in a lengthy and possibly convincing debate. They also show why Plantinga's argument is far stronger and more defensible. 1. Plantinga does not confuse ontological necessity with logical necessity, and 2. Plantinga's argument has a different definition of God and does not have an explicit reliance on the concept of God being coherent. However, it can be argued that an attack on the concept of God is an attack on all ontological arguments, including Anselm's, as he would challenge the very first premise that they are conceiving of, or they're having an idea of such being, where that conception can be argued to be confused or misinformed. So this is an additional strength of these objections. Although Plantinga's ontological argument is stronger than Malcolm's ontological argument, Plantinga's argument faces fatal objection from general attacks on ontological arguments, which crucially can be said to apply to all ontological arguments, specifically modal arguments. Hume and Bertrand Russell would claim that anything that is distinctly conceivable is logically possible. However, we can always conceive of a being existing as not existing. So we can conceive of a world which has no God in it. Therefore, no being can exist necessarily, including God. Moreover, Russell adds to this in a debate with Copleston that it is highly inappropriate to use the term necessary applied to a being. Such being, a necessary being, is an incoherent concept, as a term of necessity, and the language of necessity can only be appropriately used with logical propositions and propositional logic in general. A defender of Plantinga could attack this objection by claiming that just because we can conceive of something, it does not mean that that thing must exist. Conceivability arguments are flawed as they reflect our epistemic limitations. For instance, what does a world without God actually look like? It can be said that Hume is confused and misinformed in conceiving of God not existing. Just because one can conceive of something, it does not mean it is metaphysically possible. This inference can always be challenged, i.e. via the mass man fallacy. However, this response highlights exactly everything that is wrong with ontological arguments. It can be argued that most ontological arguments are conceivability arguments, because they rely on having the idea of a god in one's mind, or arguing that something is possible because it can be conceived as such. Therefore, this response is a self-defeating response, and further to add to that, Plantinga and other ontological arguments at best show that if God exists, then he must exist necessarily. So the conclusion that God exists is begging the question, as it's assuming the truth of its conclusion. This exchange is the most crucial in this whole essay. Malcolm and Plantinga avoid Kant's objection because they move to a modal framework, but the modal framework of logic is deeply flawed. As Hume points out, the concept of a necessary being is flawed, and Russell's insight that it is inappropriate to use necessity on a being and only applies to propositions. In conclusion, I have demonstrated in this essay that all ontological arguments fail to be successfully defensible. It is a dilemma for a defender of ontological arguments. Either they accept a form of non-modal arguments which avoid this objection but face Kant's fatal objection, or they accept of a modal argument which gets obliterated by Hume and Russell. And let's not forget about the general idea that ontological arguments essentially beg the question, as they assume the truth of their conclusions. However, it is the case of modal arguments that they are stronger than non-modal arguments because they are susceptible to less objections, so they are more easily defendable. However, Malcolm's argument is the weaker between the two, as his argument is overly reliant on the concept of God and commits a fallacy of composition. You should say equivocation. What is interactionist dualism? Interactionist dualism are theories of the mind which either claim that 1. There are two ontologically fundamental substances, physical and mental substances can causally interact with other mental physical substances, interactionist substance dualism, and 2. Although there is one fundamental physical substance, there are two different properties, physical and mental properties, including phenomenal properties, where phenomenal properties neither supervene or can be reduced to physical properties, and phenomenal properties can causally interact with other properties. Interactionist property dualism. The AQA masters were very, very nice when it came to God, but when it came to mind, they decided to make a U-turn. Now, the 3 marker is actually quite a nice one, and I'm not talking about this being the issue. Although the way I've been marked, I'm very confused to why I didn't get 3 out of 3, but I got 2 out of 2. I mean, the feedback was that this was clear and full, but lacked something. I don't remember what actual feedback was. I mean, I got highlighted this sentence: mental substances can causally interact with other mental physical substances. What is wrong with that? That is a claim of substance dualism, where you can't, where the phenomenal properties can't interact with other properties. They causally inert. That's the word we use. So when describing the theory that is in opposition to interactionism, and I talk about how they can interact with each other, why on earth is that imprecision? I'm very confused. If someone can point out to me, please, I'd be very, very happy to know why. Explain mind-brain type identity theory. Mind-brain type identity theory is a reductionist physicalist theory of the mind which claims that mental states types are type identical to physical brain states and types. They make a claim of ontological reduction, where things in one domain can be completely explained in terms or are identical to things in another domain. Of mental states to physical brain states. For example, the mental state of pain is identical to C fibers firing in the brain, as opposed to an analytic reduction. The meaning of C fibers firing cannot be reduced to the meaning of the mental state pain. This explains why they are a physicalist theory. All that exists is either reducible to or supervenient upon the physical. Hence, it denies the existence of any substance that is not physical. I got 5 out of 5 in this 5 marker. It's probably one of the shortest one. I think when you don't understand something and you don't have time to learn it, you just memorize it. And I do understand MBTI. I'm a fan of it. So a lot of these sentences are sentences that I could remember from class or from the model answers. Enough to explain how the knowledge-Mary argument can be applied as an objection to functionalism. Frank Jackson's knowledge argument is an argument that seeks to show that not all facts are physical and functional facts, and therefore physicalism, which is the view that all that exists is reducible to or supervenient upon the physical, is false. Functionalism is the theory of the mind which claims that mental states are functional states, and because functional states, physical states, determine the world, all facts are functional plus physical facts. The knowledge argument is a thought experiment about Mary, who is a color scientist who has been living her whole life in a black and white room. And Mary has all the knowledge about color science that complete physics would give her. Premise 1. All facts are physical plus functional facts. Premise 2. When Mary leaves her black and white room, she sees a red tomato, and Jackson argues she gains a new fact about phenomenal concept of red, saying red has these phenomenal properties in humans. Conclusion. Therefore, not all facts are physical plus functional facts. Some facts are phenomenal facts. Therefore, the conclusion directly challenges the functionalist claim about all facts being functional plus physical facts, as there are other facts, such as phenomenal facts, which functionalism cannot account at all, and hence this objection shows that functionalism cannot give an account of phenomenal properties of the mind. I am very happy that I have some of the best philosophy teachers out there teaching me. Because if it wasn't for my mind teacher, there is absolutely no way I would have known how to tackle this question. She had the whole model answer and an answer that was understandable. And she also taught us how to, and told us beforehand how to answer these kind of questions. This question was unusual. It probably has annoyed a lot of people, and I'm just glad I remembered how to answer it and what to say in it. And I did get 5 out of 5 in this 5 mark, and I'm very pleased about this. Explain substance dualism and explain how Ryle argues that this theory makes a category mistake. Substance dualism is a theory of mind which claims that there are two ontologically fundamental substances, physical substance and mental substances, where mental substances are distinct from physical substances. Substance dualism can claim that one, mental substances can causally interact with other mental physical substances, interactionist substances dualism, and two, mental substance cannot causally interact with physical substances as they are causally inert, epiphenomenalist substance dualism. However, Ryle claims that substance dualism is making a category mistake. A category mistake is to treat a concept belonging to a different logical category than the one which it actually belongs to. Numbers are heavy, numbers aren't the sort of thing to have weight. The example of a category mistake is when someone goes to visit the University of Oxford and they look at every building and then after the tour they ask, so where is the University of Oxford? As they think of it being a building of some sort. Ryle claims that substance dualism is making a category mistake in placing the mind in a category of substance. Dosed in a machine expression, the mind could be constituted of properties, or talk of the mind could just be talk of behaviors and dispositions, as Ryle affirms. And Ryle additionally argues that the interactionist substance dualist is making a second category mistake by treating mental properties as belonging to broadly the same category of physical properties, i.e., what they call the mechanical or paramechanical hypothesis of causes and effects. In summary, substance dualism is a dualist theory of the mind which claims that there are two ontologically fundamental substances, but Ryle objects as he argues that substance dualism is making the category mistake of treating the mind as a substance and mental properties as belonging to broadly the same category of physical properties. This 12 marker is probably the biggest upset in this paper. I was very happy when I saw it because I knew what to talk about. And I think it's just my first paragraph was not long enough or didn't have enough content. To a 7, I mean I got 7 out of 12. Maybe an 8 or 9, but 7, seriously? I mean I don't think 7 was that was a very harsh mark. But considering I got marked very leniently literally elsewhere, I can't complain. Now I am. This is the same thought I had with this other friend doing the same, who had this same thought. But when it came to talking about substance dualism, making the second category mistake, which I'm sure most people forgot about the paramechanical hypothesis that Ryle talks about. I am pretty sure that's only relevant to interactionist substance dualism. That's why there is a bracket interactionist. And I'm pretty sure if I didn't, that could have been an imprecision, because Ryle is talking about interactionist substance dualism, not all forms of substance dualism. Because then, I mean, substance dualism, that epiphenomenal substance dualism will not be affected by this issue. So I'm glad I clarified this. I'm pretty sure he got 11 or 12 in this 12 marker, and we had these similar ideas. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure a lot of people didn't realize this, and that there is even a second categorical mistake that Ryle points out substance dualism to be making. When I talked about AQA being very, very harsh when it comes to the questions, I think in paper one it was quite obvious some of the phrasing wasn't very much on the side of the students. But this essay, I mean, we were all expecting property dualism. And I was sure it was property dualism. But deep inside, I did not want it to be property dualism because I hate property dualism. I can't write about it. I am very bad at articulating myself when it comes to property dualism. But I had a plan, and I was going to stick to it. Until a friend of mine talks about him thinking about limited materialism being the essay that was going to come up. And I had like maybe 5 minutes to think about what I would write if it was actually limited materialism. Turns out it is about limited materialism, more specifically about the claims it makes about our common sense understanding of the mind, which is a very long question, probably the most complicated 25 mark on question that you can make. Now, most of this is stuff I purely came out on the spot, and I got 23 out of 25. So I'm extremely proud of this. If there was a essay I was going to think that I flopped, it'll probably be this essay. But it turns out it's my highest scoring essay, tying with the ontological argument essay. I was very happy. I think I could talk about this a lot, but I am afraid that limited materialism is also something that I can't really talk about or articulate very well. But I think because it's a lot about the language surrounding limited materialism, the talk of the mind, and the arguments are about that, I think it was something that played into my interests, which are language and like the veracity of the arguments. The arguments I made are that the articulation of a limited materialism can be self-refuting. The consideration of the certainty of our mental state should take priority over any other argument, including limited materialism. And my most crucial argument was that some concepts which are part of our common sense understanding of the mind are incredibly helpful, especially in fields like psychology. And funnily enough, there was this one video I watched the night before. It was from Gideon, and it was about the 12 worst child criminals. And in one of them, they talked about how they used, I think, some scans or something. I don't remember exactly what it was about. Um, and they used neuroscience to determine that this person had this pattern of this criminal behavior. And it's something I talked about in my essay. And also there's this reference to this Veritasium video about the experiment they made about why people prefer the number 37. So you can really tell that I pulled everything out of nowhere, and I absolutely did not have a plan for my essay. I think not planning I'm absolutely not urging anyone to not plan essays. Absolutely plan your essays. But when you're first writing your essay as a practice, I think it's a good exercise to sit down and try to work without a plan and see what you come up with. And if you keep on doing this cycle of sitting down and without a plan, and then write something, and then you look over it, and then you rewrite it, and then slowly you form a plan. Because in your head, when you are under pressure, you think about, do I really want to talk about this? Am I wasting time? You're under pressure. And I think that's something very important.
Is eliminative materialism correct to claim that our common sense understanding of the mind is radically mistaken? In this essay, I will argue that although eliminative materialism can provide accounts and arguments for our common sense understanding of the mind to be radically mistaken, eliminative materialism as a theory fails to be successful in correctly showing this to be the case. Because, one, the articulation of eliminative materialism can be argued to be self refuting, and two, the consideration of the certainty of our mental state should take priority over any other argument, including the argument from it in limited materialism. And most crucially, three, some concepts which are part of our common sense understanding of the mind are incredibly helpful in predicting and explaining human behavior and aid other scientific and human fields like the understanding of behavioral psychology. In order to begin this essay, I will first outline a few terms and arguments that I will refer to in this essay and use throughout. Eliminative materialism is a physicalist theory, the view that all that exists is supervenient upon or reducible to the physical, of the mind, which claims that at least some of our basic concepts which may come from folk psychology are fundamentally mistaken, and as such they should be eliminated, as what they refer to does not exist. Example of folk psychological concept that should be eliminated are intentionality, as Paul Churchland argues that it cannot be ontologically reduced, where things in one domain can be completely explained in terms of, or are identical to things in another domain, to physical brain properties. Intentionality is a property of mental states whereby they are directed towards an intentional mental object, i.e., they are about something. E.g., they believe that Paris is the capital of France is about Paris. Eliminative materialism endorses a picture of the understanding of mental states where mental states are completely understood in a language of physics and neuroscience. Folk psychology is a theory of the mind or body of knowledge about the explanations and prediction for human behavior which comes from the platitudes which ordinary people are inclined to endorse. E.g., if someone hates Paris in the summer, they will not book a trip to Paris in August. Folk psychology understands mental states to be intentional. They describe the world in partial and particular ways, and it's precisely this that folk psychologists argues that explains the motivational force behind someone acting in a certain way. For instance, an example of the person who hates Paris in the summer and they will not book a trip there in August, the intentional object of Paris is portrayed as hot, humid, and uncomfortable. The first argument I will give is that eliminative materialism is self-refuting, proves itself to be false, and therefore is not correct in our common sense understanding of the mind as radically mistaken. Firstly, when someone makes an argument, they are making a set of claims, premises that lead to a conclusion. When one is making sets of claims, they are also asserting a belief about those claims. The belief here is an intentional mental state because it is about something. Specifically, it could be about the content of the claim, e.g., that the content of the claim is true. So it can be said that the articulation of eliminative materialism is self-refuting, because when they make the claim that at least some of our basic common sense concepts about the mind that usually come from folk psychology are mistaken, e.g., we should eliminate the concept of intentionality because what it refers to does not exist. In making this claim, they are asserting the very concept, intentional mental states,
of belief that they seek to eliminate. Therefore, it can be said that eliminative materialism is self-refuting. However, the eliminative materialist could object to this argument by saying that the articulation of eliminative materialism can be made without the use of beliefs, and that in this case it is being used as a condition of intelligibility. Because eliminative materialism endorses a future where mental states are completely understood in terms of physical and neuroscientific concepts. In a future where we do have these concepts, the articulation of eliminative materialism can be done without asserting beliefs as they ought to be eliminated. Paul Churchland claims that physical processes are not about anything. When we digest food, our stomach digests them through enzymes and chemical processes. None of these chemical processes are about anything, and hence cannot be intentional, and therefore this is why intentional mental states should be eliminated. However, we can object to the claim that the belief asserted here is a condition of intelligibility, because the eliminative materialist needs to at least concede that they are asserting a belief, an intentional mental state, and even if it is possible in the future to give an account of eliminative materialism based on purely neuroscientific and physical terms, the eliminative materialist cannot do so as of now, and therefore needs to accept that as of now the articulation is at least flawed. This is the least crucial argument in this essay because it is possible that in principle there could be a future where neuroscience explains every concept in terms of physical concepts. And therefore, as Paul Churchland explains, we ought to eliminate the concept of intentionality as physical processes are not about anything. However, this next objection is more crucial because it appeals to our ability to introspect and the fact that we have direct, non-inferential access to our mind. When I introspect, I gain a direct first-person awareness of my own mind's mental states, which are intentional. Examples of intentional mental states include beliefs, desires, and emotions. The introspection of my own mind gives me a degree of certainty about my intentional mental states that any argument cannot match. The force, conceivability of the premises of any argument cannot match the certainty I have about my own mental states, and this includes arguments from the eliminative materialist that we ought to eliminate intentional mental states because what they refer to does not exist. Some of these mental states are concepts which folk psychology advocates for, and form these concepts form some of our common sense understanding of the mind. The eliminative materialist could argue that a complete analysis of the mind in terms of neuroscience could explain this phenomena in terms of purely scientific terms without needing to rely on intentional mental states. Furthermore, the eliminative materialist could push on the reasons why should we take our certainty about our own mental states to be enough to be put against any argument. For instance, some theories of the difference between the unconscious and the conscious explain that one may consciously desire one thing, but that then actually unconsciously desire the opposite. This challenges my objection because it hinges on the fact that nothing can top the certainty and ability to introspect into my own mind and understand my own mental states. However, we can counter this response by arguing that even if the certainty of our own mental states are enough to dismiss any opposing arguments, including the eliminative materialist, this does not prove the eliminative materialist to be right. Furthermore, false psychology supports this idea that we have intentional mental states and we can introspect into them to gain a certain understanding of them. This exchange shows that eliminative materialist is not exactly fit to make claims about our common sense understanding of the mind being radically mistaken, not only because we have personal and private certainty about our own mental states, but also these explain why we behave in certain ways. I know I am sad because I can introspectively know that I have the intentional mental state of sad, and this anger is what is causing me to cry, because people who cry tend to have the intentional mental state of sadness. The sadness may be something about, e.g., an exam which did not go the way they wanted. My most crucial objection against eliminative materialism being incorrect in claiming that our common sense understanding of the mind is radically mistaken is that folk psychology, which forms a lot of our common sense understanding of the mind, is extremely helpful in predicting and explaining human behavior. For instance, we can explain why someone went to the kitchen and opened the fridge using folk psychological concepts. A person went to the kitchen because they believe, intentional mental state, there is a fridge, and they ignore everything else in the kitchen because intentional objects represent the world in partial and particular ways to open the fridge. And they open the fridge because they feel hungry, because they are, e.g., sad or any other intentional mental state. And when they open the fridge, they get food. We can predict that this person will be happy, another intentional mental state, and would probably buy the same food when they are sad again, and etc. This explanation both explains the motivations and intentions of the individual and allows us to make predictions in the future based on how intentional mental states can be said to interact. However, an explanation that the eliminative materialist will endorse in terms of purely physical and neuroscientific concept does not allow us to make the same breadth of explanation. The person opened the fridge and took something to eat, as neuron A fired to neuron B, which activated this electrochemical process, and etc. This explanation does not tell us anything about why the person opened the fridge. It does not tell us about what this could mean in the future, the same way a common sense based or false psychological explanation could give us. The eliminative materialists could object to this by explaining the motivations behind why they seek to make eliminations. In the past, science used to understand heat in terms of the caloric theory, which assumed heat was something that existed not as a property of molecules, but as an actual unit in objects. This theory has been abandoned after a better and more advanced theory of understanding heat as a mean molecular kinetic energy of an object, as it better explained the world and fits experimental data. Therefore, the theory of caloric theory was eliminated, as what it refers to, the unit of heat, does not exist in the object. A future explanation about the person opening the fridge will give, according to the limited materialist, the best possible explanation, as one, it does not use concepts that don't exist, i.e., intentional mental states, and two, it tells us exactly which parts of our brain are activated and which neurons are fired, and it is uncharitable to claim that neuroscience won't be able to help us understand motivations and intentions of agents. In support of two, we can use examples of how neuroscience is used in some court cases. A person can be tested to see which parts of their brain activates based on certain stimuli to determine causal relationships between the stimuli and brain activations or brain patterns in general. And this could be helpful in determining and differentiating whether an offender has committed a crime as a second thought, or it was a habit of the offender, or the offender has a neurological dysfunctions which explain why they acted in certain ways, e.g., psychopathy. For instance, this was helpful in determining and understanding traumas not just within the context of law and justice. Arguably, these kinds of explanation are far more extensive and crucially truthful and meaningful than the explanation full psychology endorses. As their explanations are radically mistaken, any other theory in the field of the sciences has evolved since ancient times, often having to eliminate most of its concepts and replace them with new ones, more empirically resourced ones. Paul Churchland claims folk psychology is radically mistaken and is therefore backwards. A lot of folk psychology can be said to make untrue and mistaken prediction and explanations, as they may be based on unjustified ideas like superstitions about stars, or far worse, folk psychology and our common sense understanding of the mind can fuel oppression and the harm of individuals fueled by societal expectations, culture, and ignorant understandings. For example, in the past, women were said to suffer from hysteria, which was used often as an oppressive and misogynistic term against women, and that their period was the hysteria leaving their body. On the last point, a defender of folk psychology could reply that with society evolving, so does our understanding of the mind and societal and cultural norms, and therefore also does our common sense understanding of the mind. For instance, the term hysteria today would be completely unacceptable, and we can explain things better without having to give up our common sense and understanding of the mind by being informed with neuroscience in general, as opposed to replacing it completely as the eliminative materialist advocates. Furthermore, it is untrue that folk psychology is an unscientific and backwards and radically mistaken body of knowledge, because it can be argued that it is the first source of knowledge that psychologists use to explain behavior, and our common sense understanding can always be empirically tested, and experiments can be constructed among our common sense understanding of the mind. For instance, a study was conducted about why we prefer the number 37, and we can give explanations using folk psychology as opposed to some neurophysical phenomena occurring. Although the eliminative materialist is motivated to turn the understanding of mind into a scientific endeavor, and hence, by starting to eliminate concepts, it fails to show that our common sense understanding of the mind is radically mistaken, because it explains, as of now, behavior better than anything else, including neurosciences, as it can be argued to be the primary source for other scientific theories like psychology. In conclusion, eliminative materialism is incorrect to claim that our common sense understanding of the mind is radically mistaken, least crucially because the articulation of any arguments from the eliminative materialist is self-refuting, more crucially because no argument from eliminative materialism is enough to take away from the certainty we have of our own mental states, and most importantly, our common sense understanding of the mind, although sometimes inaccurate as the eliminative materialists show, more often than not give good and useful explanations. Hence, it is not radically mistaken, as I have demonstrated in this essay.
I mean, overall, A level philosophy was an excellent experience. I cannot recommend it anymore. It developed me as a person a lot. It made my interest in other things that aren't philosophy much more acute. For instance, maths. That's why I am doing a maths and philosophy course. For those wondering, yes, I did get an A star in maths and further maths. I don't think I deserve to have a maths YouTube channel if I didn't get those grades. But aside from that, I'm really happy about them. Um, and I am not exactly a YouTuber, and what I do is just share my thoughts. And I do think I will be uploading much more maths with some philosophy here and there if you like the philosophy, or you want something that is in this video to be explained and talked about much in depth, please do let me know. I mean, I didn't talk about the arguments or like any of the terminology in depth. This is just my reaction to